Marcus Holloway had not intended to stop that late at night. All he wanted was to collapse into bed after 12 exhausting hours at Jefferson Hospital, where his mother had undergone heart surgery. He had refused to leave her bedside until the doctors assured him she was stable, and even then, the decision to drive home felt reluctant. The weight of the day pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. Anxiety, relief, and bone-deep fatigue rolled into one. Normally, Marcus was the image of professionalism, impeccably dressed in pressed suits that reflected his role as one of Philadelphia's most respected judges. But that night was different. Instead of a robe or formal attire, he wore a loose hoodie and faded jeans, the kind of clothes that whispered comfort over appearances. They felt almost foreign on him, like stepping into someone else's skin. Yet for hours spent slouched in a stiff hospital chair waiting on updates, they had been the only sensible choice. As he turned into a Sunoco station in Abington Township, a quiet, predominantly white suburb northeast of Philadelphia, Marcus reminded himself that he needed fuel to get home. The tank on his BMW hovered dangerously close to empty. The simple errand seemed harmless enough, a brief pause before the sanctuary of sleep. He pulled into Pump 3, slid his credit card, and began refueling. He barely noticed the first time a police cruiser circled the lot. At that hour, after midnight was fast approaching, the sight of patrol cars wasn't unusual. But when the same cruiser passed again, moving slowly like a shark circling prey, Marcus's pulse quickened. He told himself not to overthink it. He was a judge, a man who had spent 2 decades upholding the Constitution, presiding over cases of police misconduct, ensuring fairness from the bench. Logic said he had nothing to fear, but logic was not enough to steady the pit in his stomach. Inside the patrol car sat Officers Thomas Brennan and Kyle Reynolds, partners for 3 years and well-known within their department. Both were in their early 30s, crew cuts framing stern faces that seemed permanently etched into masks of authority. Their supervisors praised them for their proactive policing, pointing to the high number of arrests they logged each month. But Marcus knew better. In his courtroom, he had seen the ripple effects of officers who equated high numbers with effective work. Patterns of racial profiling, flimsy pretexts for stops, and constitutional violations swept aside by internal reviews that almost always found no wrongdoing. That night, Brennan nudged Reynolds, nodding toward Pump 3. "Check him out," Brennan muttered. "Matches the description from the Wawa robbery last week." Reynolds narrowed his eyes at the man in the hoodie. Black male, medium build, hood up. "Could be our guy." The so-called description was so vague it could have applied to thousands of men across the city. But vague was often enough when suspicion leaned on skin color more than facts. Without hesitation, the officers swung their cruiser behind Marcus's BMW, blocking it in. Marcus froze, the nozzle still in his hand. He had watched this scene unfold from the safety of the bench more times than he could count. A simple stop turning into an arrest, suspicion feeding escalation. He had ruled on the legality of these encounters, listened to community complaints, weighed officers' words against frightened citizens, but never had he been the one standing under the fluorescent glare, heart-thudding, as authority closed in. The gas pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. Marcus replaced the nozzle, lifted his chin, and tried to steady his breathing. If there was ever a time to rely on calm professionalism, it was now. "Good evening, officers," he said evenly as Brennan approached with a wide-legged stance meant to intimidate. "Is there a problem?" Brennan's eyes swept Marcus from head to toe before landing on his face. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Marcus blinked, caught between disbelief and weary amusement. He gestured to the pump. "I think it's fairly obvious. I'm getting gas. On my way home from the hospital. My mother had surgery today." "Let me see some ID," Brennan said sharply, ignoring the explanation. Marcus frowned. "May I ask why?" "I've committed no offense. I'm simply refueling my car." "You match the description of a suspect in a recent robbery," Brennan replied, voice hardening. "ID now." Marcus's pulse ticked faster. "And what exactly is that description, beyond black male?" The question landed like a slap. Brennan's jaw clenched. Reynolds stepped closer, his voice sterner. "Sir, we need you to comply with our instructions immediately." Marcus had spent years teaching law students and young attorneys about Fourth Amendment rights. He had delivered lectures at the police academy about constitutional protections during stops. Yet standing there in the chill of night, he realized theory meant little against two officers who had already decided who he was. He lifted his hand slightly, voice clear. "I'm reaching for my wallet." Moving deliberately, he slid a hand toward his back pocket. "My name is Marcus Holloway. I'm a judge with the Philadelphia County Court of Common Pleas." Brennan barked a laugh. "Sure you are." "And I'm the police commissioner." Before Marcus could retrieve the wallet, Brennan seized his arm, twisting it behind his back with sudden force. Marcus gasped as his cheek was shoved against the cold metal of the BMW. In that brutal second, centuries of history pressed down. The presumption of guilt, the reduction of identity to nothing more than skin color. "What are you doing?" Marcus ground out through clenched teeth as steel cuffs bit into his wrists. "This is unnecessary. Stop resisting," Brennan shouted, though Marcus wasn't resisting at all. "I'm not resisting. My judicial ID is in my wallet," Marcus protested, but his words fell into the void. "Yeah, we'll check that downtown," Reynolds muttered, snapping the cuffs tight. Across the lot, a young woman at another pump raised her phone, recording. "Is this really necessary?" she called. "He's just getting gas." "Ma'am, step back. This is police business," Reynolds barked. The gas station's manager, Raj Patel, rushed out from behind the counter, his face twisted with alarm. "Officers, please. This man is a regular customer, a judge." "Sir, get back inside before you interfere with police business," Brennan shouted, already pulling Marcus toward the cruiser. Marcus locked eyes with Patel in desperation. "Please, call Judge Chen at the courthouse. Tell her what's happening." The officer shoved him into the back seat like a common criminal. As the door slammed, Marcus caught sight of half a dozen bystanders, phones raised, documenting every moment. He thought of his teenage children at home, likely bent over homework, oblivious to the fact their father was being arrested for nothing more than being black in a hoodie at a gas station. In that instant, humiliation burned, but a deeper realization took hold. He had presided over countless hearings where citizens swore their innocence, where they claimed officers had profiled them, used vague descriptions, escalated without cause. He had believed many of them, but part of him had always remained the judge, separate from the lived experience. Now, stripped of the robe, the title, and the presumption of credibility, Marcus understood with startling clarity. What was happening to him was not an anomaly. It was the system functioning exactly as it had been allowed to, and though he could not yet see it, this humiliating night at Pump 3 would give him the leverage to challenge that system in ways he had never imagined. The ride to Abington Township Police Station was only 15 minutes, but for Marcus it felt like an endless descent into indignity. Wedged into the back seat of the cruiser, wrists cuffed tightly behind him, he sat in silence while officers Brennan and Reynolds chatted casually up front, as though they had just bagged a routine catch. "Got another one claiming to be important," Brennan chuckled, glancing at his partner. "Last week it was some guy swearing he was the mayor's cousin. Don't forget that woman who said she was a neurosurgeon," Reynolds added with a smirk. "Turned out she had 3 warrants." Their laughter grated, but Marcus kept his mouth shut. He had presided over enough cases to know this was not about truth. This was about narrative. In their eyes, he was already guilty, and they would spin every word, every movement, to support that belief. The station was dim and stale-smelling when they arrived. Brennan marched Marcus inside with a hand on his shoulder, announcing loudly, "Got a loiterer from the gas station. Matches the Wawa robbery suspect. Says he's a judge." The desk sergeant barely looked up from his paperwork. Around the booking area, a couple of officers snickered. The words "claims he's a judge" hung in the air like the punchline to a joke. "Name?" the sergeant asked flatly. "Marcus Holloway," he replied evenly, though his chest tightened with frustration. "I am a judge with the Philadelphia County Court of Common Pleas, and I demand my phone call immediately." The sergeant's expression didn't shift. "Sure you are. Empty your pockets on the counter. I'd like to make my phone call first. That is my right." The simple assertion seemed to irritate them more than defiance would have. Brennan crossed his arms. Reynolds rolled his eyes. They wanted compliance. Silent, unquestioning submission. Marcus realized they were deliberately delaying his call, keeping him isolated long enough to craft their version of events. When the cuffs were finally removed, his wrists ached. He placed his belongings on the counter one by one. Keys, wallet, phone. The sergeant thumbed through his wallet with deliberate disinterest, flipping past his driver's license, glancing briefly at the gleaming judicial identification card embossed with the state seal, and setting it aside as though it were meaningless. "Belt and shoes, too," the sergeant ordered. Marcus complied, the cold floor seeping through his socks. For a fleeting moment he thought of all the defendants who had stood exactly where he stood now, dignity stripped away under the fluorescent buzz. He had seen it from the bench, but never felt the sting firsthand. How many of those men had told the truth, ignored as he was now? How many had no one to believe them? The thought gnawed at him until a small shift in the room interrupted his spiral. A younger officer entered, balancing a coffee cup in one hand. He glanced at Marcus and froze. His brow furrowed, then lifted in recognition. "Judge Holloway?" he asked hesitantly. The room stilled. Marcus turned, studying the face of the young black officer. He recognized him vaguely but could not place the context. "Yes, officer," Marcus replied. "Do we know each other?" "Jackson, sir. Darrell Jackson. You gave a lecture at the Academy last year on constitutional rights during arrests." Jackson's voice carried both respect and unease as he looked around at his colleagues. "Is everything okay here?" The sergeant's eyes narrowed. "You know this guy, Jackson?" Jackson straightened. "Yes, sir. He's definitely a judge. I sat in his lecture. I remember." The ripple of silence that followed was palpable. The officers who had laughed now shifted uncomfortably. Even Brennan and Reynolds stiffened, glancing at each other with sudden unease. It was one thing to mock a man who claimed to be important. It was another to realize that man might actually outrank every one of them in ways that mattered. Within minutes, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Captain William Preston burst into the booking area, his face flushed with alarm. His gaze landed on Marcus and faltered. "Judge Holloway," he said quickly, "there seems to have been a terrible misunderstanding." Marcus met his eyes, steady and unyielding. "Indeed, Captain. A misunderstanding of constitutional rights, proper procedure, and basic human dignity." The words landed like heavy stones in the room. Preston faltered, then ordered the cuffs removed, and Marcus's belongings returned. As Marcus dialed his phone, he noticed Brennan and Reynolds being ushered into the captain's office. Through the glass pane, he saw defensive postures, animated gestures, the familiar dance of officers constructing their story. He had seen it countless times before. Reports tailored to protect reputations, language chosen carefully to deflect scrutiny. They would argue he had been uncooperative, that he had matched a description, that they had acted in good faith. But Marcus also knew something else. This time, the truth had witnesses. Phones had recorded. Patel had seen, and most of all, the system they relied on to shield them had just cracked. For the first time that night, Marcus allowed himself a small breath of relief. His humiliation was not over, but the balance of power had shifted. Little did Brennan and Reynolds realize that their attempt to assert dominance at a gas station had placed them on a collision course with the very machinery of justice they thought they controlled. The morning after his humiliating arrest, Marcus Holloway walked through the judge's entrance of the Philadelphia County Courthouse with shoulders squared and jaw tight. The same security guards who had greeted him countless times before now treated him with exaggerated deference, their eyes flicking toward him with awkward respect. They had all seen the viral video circulating since dawn. Clips of a respected black judge shoved against his car, handcuffed like a criminal and forced into the back of a patrol cruiser. For Marcus, the robe that hung on his office door felt heavier than ever before. The black fabric had always symbolized impartiality and authority, but that morning it carried something else: armor. His dignity had been stripped the night before, and now he needed the robe to restore it. His clerk entered carrying a stack of files. "Judge Sanderson called in sick," she explained. "Severe food poisoning. You've been reassigned to his docket." She hesitated, sensing his distracted state. "That includes the police misconduct hearing in Courtroom 4B. Marcus reached for the file, flipping it open, only to feel the air sucked from his lungs. The complainant? Antoine Johnson, a young black man. The defendants? Officers Thomas Brennan and Kyle Reynolds. The very same officers who had slammed him against his BMW not even 24 hours earlier. For a long moment, Marcus stared at the papers in silence. The words blurred as memory replayed, the cuffs biting into his wrists, Brennan's mocking laugh, Reynolds's dismissive tone. He forced himself to focus, reading through the complaint with meticulous care, Johnson's story mirrored his own, almost exactly. Stopped for vague reasons, treated aggressively when he questioned the stop, accused of resisting though he remained calm. The difference was stark. Johnson had no judicial ID, no professional reputation, no witnesses willing to step forward on his behalf. Internal Affairs had cleared Brennan and Reynolds without hesitation. Complaints against them, 5 for Brennan, 7 for Reynolds, had all been dismissed. Marcus's stomach turned. It was a pattern, not an accident. A knock broke his concentration. District Attorney Sandra Whitman stepped into his office, visibly uncomfortable. "Judge Holloway," she began, "given last night's incident, the department has concerns about impartiality. You may want to consider recusal." Marcus closed the file deliberately. "I've reviewed the ethics guidelines. There's no absolute requirement for recusal. The matter before the court today involves different facts and different parties." "But the same officers," Whitman pressed, her tone cautious. "The same precinct." "Which means," Marcus replied firmly, "that I have relevant insight into departmental practices. If you wish to raise the issue formally, I'll hear the motion in open court. Not here, behind closed doors." Whitman inclined her head, recognizing that the conversation was over. As she left, Marcus exhaled slowly. This was no longer just about Johnson. It was about a system that had allowed Brennan and Reynolds to operate unchecked. When the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise!" the courtroom seemed to vibrate with energy. Every seat was filled. Reporters crammed into the press section. Community activists held handmade signs demanding justice. Uniformed officers lined the back, their presence an unsubtle show of solidarity with their colleagues. At the defense table sat Brennan and Reynolds with their union attorney. Their posture was confident until they turned and saw the judge entering. Recognition dawned in their faces like a thunderclap. Brennan's mouth fell open. Reynolds went pale, his hands tightening around his chair. At the plaintiff's table, Antoine Johnson sat beside his public defender, wide-eyed with disbelief. To him it must have felt surreal. His modest complaint had drawn unprecedented attention, and now the presiding judge was the very man arrested by the defendants. Marcus ascended to the bench with calm precision. The whispers in the gallery swelled until his gavel cracked once against the wood. "Be seated." He let the silence settle before speaking. "We are here in the matter of Johnson versus Abington Township Police Department." He paused deliberately. "Before we proceed, I should acknowledge that I recognize Officers Brennan and Reynolds from a personal encounter last night, which some of you may have seen reported in the media." The room erupted in hushed conversation. The union attorney shot to his feet. "Your Honor, we respectfully request your immediate recusal." Marcus had anticipated the motion. "Your objection is noted," he said calmly. "I will hear arguments momentarily. But first, Mr. Johnson, are you prepared to proceed today?" Johnson swallowed, nodding slowly. "Yes, Your Honor." Marcus turned his gaze back to the courtroom. "Let me be clear. Justice must not only be done, but must be seen to be done. The question before us is whether I can preside impartially. I believe I can. But I will hear arguments to the contrary." The union attorney strode to the podium, launching into a familiar refrain about fairness, impartiality, and conflicts of interest. Meanwhile, Brennan and Reynolds whispered furiously at the defense table, their earlier bravado collapsing into visible panic. Marcus watched them with the detached observation of a man who had seen hundreds of defendants realize the walls were closing in. There was a particular look in their eyes, confusion, fear, and the dawning recognition that their actions carried consequences. For Marcus, the moment crystallized. Less than a day earlier, he had been humiliated, stripped of dignity, reduced to suspect because of the color of his skin. Now he held the gavel, the authority, the chance to shine light on the very conduct that had nearly broken him. The irony was sharp, but so was the responsibility. This was no stage for revenge. This was a stage for justice. When the motion for recusal was finally argued and denied, the case proceeded. Johnson's quiet determination stood against the polished bluster of the union lawyer. The community's hope clashed with the department's instinct for self-preservation, and at the center of it all sat Marcus Holloway, robe draped across his shoulders like armor, gavel in hand, hot, steady. The battle was no longer just Antoine Johnson's. It was Marcus's. It was the community's. It was about whether the law could pierce through the blue wall of silence and restore faith in justice. The trial had barely begun. but already the air was electric with the possibility of change. The hum of whispered voices filled Courtroom 4B as the first witness was sworn in. Antoine Johnson, a soft-spoken young man with tired eyes, took the stand. He glanced nervously toward the gallery, where activists held signs that read, "Justice for All" and "Stop Racial Profiling." His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone, but his voice carried strength born of lived experience. He described the night he was pulled over, how officers Brennan and Reynolds had claimed his tail light was out, how he had calmly asked why he was stopped, and how their demeanor changed instantly, from routine to aggressive. They had ordered him out of his car, cuffed him, and accused him of resisting even though he had complied. His words painted a picture Marcus knew all too well. It was a mirror of his own encounter at the gas station, vague suspicion escalating into humiliation. When Johnson's attorney, Gabriela Rivera, asked whether he had been confrontational, Johnson shook his head firmly. "No, ma'am. I knew better than that. I kept my hands visible. I stayed calm. I just wanted to know why I was being pulled over. I didn't want any trouble." The defense attorney leaned into the microphone with skepticism. "And yet the officers' reports describe you as belligerent, aggressive, and uncooperative. Why would they say that if it wasn't true?" Johnson looked straight ahead, jaw tightening. "Because that's what they always say." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Marcus's gavel cracked once, restoring order. But inside, he recognized the bitter truth in Johnson's words. He had read enough police reports to know that phrases like belligerent and furtive movement were code, shields crafted to justify unconstitutional stops. Rivera's next move shifted the tide. "Your Honor, the plaintiff would like to submit video evidence recorded by a bystander." On the projection screen, shaky cell phone footage flickered to life. The gallery leaned forward as Johnson appeared on screen, standing calmly beside his car, hands visible, voice measured. The officer's written claims of aggression unraveled instantly. The video showed compliance, not confrontation. The defense squirmed, objecting to the incomplete context. But the damage was done. The jury of public opinion, journalists scribbling furiously, community members recording, had seen enough. Then came the next witness. Rivera called two individuals who had filed complaints against Brennan and Reynolds in the past year. Both described encounters that sounded eerily familiar. Vague reasons for stops, escalating aggression when they asked questions, accusations of resistance when they remained calm. Each complaint had been dismissed by internal affairs as unfounded. Patterns were emerging, too glaring to ignore. During a recess, a new figure slipped quietly into the courtroom, Raj Patel, the Sunoco station manager. He approached Rivera and whispered urgently. Moments later, she rose. "Your Honor, we request to call an additional witness." Patel walked to the stand, adjusting his tie nervously. "Officers Brennan and Reynolds come to my station often," he testified. "They always question black and brown customers, asking why they're there. It happens so often I can predict it." He hesitated, glancing at Marcus. "After what happened to Judge Holloway last night, I checked our security footage. We keep recordings for insurance." Rivera produced a laptop. "Your Honor, Mr. Patel has provided us with footage from March 14th, the night Mr. Johnson was arrested. The video projected onto the screen was devastating. It showed Brennan and Reynolds at the gas station an hour before Johnson's arrest, leaning against their cruiser, discussing their plans. Reynolds' voice carried clearly. "Let's check the south side. Always good for a few stops there." The south side was predominantly black and Latino. The officer's casual talk of quotas, "We just need one or two more before the end of the shift," echoed through the silent courtroom like a confession. Brennan and Reynolds stared at the screen, faces pale. Their union attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The video, unfiltered and undeniable, confirmed what so many in the community had long suspected. Stops were not about public safety, but about numbers. When Captain William Preston took the stand as a departmental witness, Marcus leaned forward. "Captain, does your department use quotas for traffic stops?" Preston shifted in his seat. "We have performance metrics, not quotas," he replied carefully. "And what happens," Marcus pressed, "when officers fail to meet those metrics?" Preston hesitated. "Their performance reviews may reflect lower initiative." In other words, Marcus summarized. Officers face consequences if they don't meet numbers. So they have an incentive to make stops regardless of constitutional justification. The captain's silence spoke volumes. Then came the most critical testimonies. When Brennan and Reynolds took the stand, their stories diverged almost immediately. Brennan claimed Johnson had reached toward his waistband, prompting a safety concern. Reynolds contradicted him, saying Johnson had moved toward his glove compartment. Neither movement appeared in the video, and neither officer had mentioned these details in their original reports. Rivera pounced. So which is it, waistband or glove compartment? The contradiction hung in the air, unraveling their credibility thread by thread. Marcus's questions cut deeper. Officer Brennan, you testified the vehicle's taillight was out, yet a mechanic's inspection the following morning found all lights functioning. How do you explain this discrepancy? Brennan swallowed hard. It must have been repaired overnight. And you testified Mr. Johnson was belligerent, yet the video shows him calm. Explain that. He became aggressive after the camera malfunctioned, Brennan muttered. How convenient, Marcus said dryly, making a note. Reynolds fared no better. When pressed about the gas station conversation, he stammered, That's just how we talk. It doesn't mean anything. So you weren't planning stops to meet a quota? Rivera asked. Reynolds faltered, glancing nervously at Captain Preston before whispering, There's pressure to show results. Pressure from whom? Reynolds' eyes dropped. From supervision, from the department culture. A ripple of gasps moved through the gallery. During another recess, Officer Darrell Jackson, the young officer who had recognized Marcus at booking, approached Rivera discreetly. When court resumed, Rivera called him to the stand. Jackson shifted uncomfortably under the weight of his colleague's stares, but his voice was steady. Several officers wanted to come forward about departmental practices. We feared retaliation. But I'll speak. Marcus allowed sealed testimony to protect identities, a controversial but necessary move. What followed was explosive. Officers revealed that they were coached to use specific phrases in reports. Furtive movements, matches description, appeared nervous. These phrases, they explained, almost always held up in court. Supervisors encouraged aggressive policing in minority neighborhoods. Officers who questioned the culture faced stalled careers. One testified, We were told outright, if you want your stop to stick, use those words. The gallery buzzed with outrage. Then, in a stunning turn, Reynolds broke rank. After an intense whispered exchange with his attorney, he addressed the court directly. I need to clarify. The pressure is worse than I said. We were trained to use vague justifications. It's systematic. We were told to keep numbers up even if it meant stretching the truth. The admission detonated like a bomb. Reporters scrambled to capture every word. Brennan, red-faced and seething, snapped. He slammed a hand on the defense table. This is ridiculous. We were doing our jobs. If people would just comply instead of making everything about race. His attorney tried to hush him, but Brennan exploded, voice rising. You all want special treatment. Even as a judge, you think you're above the law. He jabbed a finger toward Marcus, spit flying. Marcus let him rant a moment, the courtroom stunned by the raw prejudice spilling out. Then he spoke calmly, gavel-tapping once. Officer Brennan, that will be enough. Your comments are now part of the record. Brennan slumped back, realization dawning that his own outburst had exposed what no cross-examination could, the deep-seated bias fueling his actions. Marcus's gaze swept the room. He had presided over many cases, but never one that cut so directly to the marrow of systemic injustice. He saw Reynolds' shame, Jackson's quiet bravery, Brennan's fury, and the captain's discomfort. He saw a community that had long been gaslit, now hearing their reality affirmed under oath. The defense had collapsed, but the implications stretched far beyond the two officers at the table. The case was no longer just Johnson versus Brennan and Reynolds. It was community versus system. And as the gavel fell to adjourn for the day, Marcus knew tomorrow would bring not just a verdict on two men, but a reckoning for an entire department. The tension inside Courtroom 4B was thick enough to press down on every chest when Marcus Holloway finally leaned forward, hands folded on the bench. For 2 days, the testimony had piled higher and higher. Videos, contradictions, whistleblowers, even an unguarded outburst that stripped the mask off Officer Brennan. The defense had unraveled. The patterns were undeniable. Now the room waited for the man in the black robe to render judgment. Marcus took a breath. the weight of responsibility heavy but clear. This court finds that Officers Thomas Brennan and Kyle Reynolds violated the constitutional rights of Mr. Antoine Johnson through racial profiling and excessive force. He began, his voice carrying evenly through the hushed room. Whispers rippled across the gallery. Journalists scribbled furiously. Johnson sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, eyes wide, hands clasped tightly. For the first time since the case began, hope flickered openly on his face. But Marcus wasn't finished. He straightened the papers before him, then looked directly at the uniformed officers lined along the back wall. Furthermore, the evidence demonstrates that these violations are not isolated incidents, but part of broader departmental practices. This court cannot ignore the patterns revealed through testimony and corroborated by video evidence. Justice demands not only accountability for individuals, but reform of the system that enabled them. He paused deliberately, allowing the words to settle. The community members in the gallery leaned forward, listening with breath held. The officers shifted uneasily, eyes darting toward one another. The remedy, Marcus continued, must address both levels. Accordingly, Officers Brennan and Reynolds are suspended without pay for 6 months, pending additional review of their conduct. They will undergo mandatory retraining in constitutional policing prior to any reinstatement. But this alone is insufficient. He raised the gavel slightly, tapping once for emphasis. The department shall immediately implement body cameras for all patrol officers, with civilian oversight to ensure compliance. The current performance evaluation system, one that rewards high stop and arrest numbers regardless of constitutional justification, shall be revised to prioritize lawful policing and community engagement. A civilian oversight committee will be established with genuine authority to review complaints, monitor investigations, and make binding recommendations. A murmur of astonishment spread through the courtroom. Marcus's orders went far beyond the scope of a typical misconduct ruling. This was not just a slap on the wrist. It was a blueprint for systemic change. But the judge's gaze grew harder. Most significantly, the court orders a comprehensive review of all arrests conducted by the Abington Township Police Department over the past 3 years, where the justification was listed as matches description, furtive movements, or similarly vague language. Any arrests found to lack sufficient legal basis shall be subject to expungement and appropriate remedies. The gallery erupted. Gasps, muffled cheers, even tears. The defense attorney slumped back in his chair, pale with shock. Brennan glared, jaw clenched. But even he seemed to recognize the tide had turned. Reynolds sat rigid, eyes lowered, perhaps realizing that his partial honesty had helped dismantle the very system he had once protected. At the plaintiff's table, Antoine Johnson blinked rapidly, overwhelmed. He had come into this courthouse expecting a routine dismissal, another rubber-stamped defense of the status quo. Now he was hearing not only his vindication, but reforms that could protect countless others like him. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Thank you," though it was unclear whether the words were directed at his lawyer, the judge, or the unseen weight of justice itself. Marcus allowed the sound in the gallery to fade before speaking again. The evidence presented in this case raises questions not only about 2 officers, but about departmental culture as a whole. Therefore, the court recommends, and expects, that the District Attorney's Office pursue a broader review of Abington Township Police Department practices. The people deserve assurance that their protectors uphold, not undermine, constitutional rights. He lifted the gavel one final time. This matter is concluded. Court is adjourned. The crack echoed like a shot. For a heartbeat, the room remained frozen. Then the dam broke. Reporters rushed for the exit. Activists embraced. Uniformed officers whispered among themselves. Some looked furious, others conflicted, a few quietly relieved. Marcus rose slowly from the bench, feeling the robe heavy on his shoulders but no longer burdensome. Today it was more than armor. It was a tool, a channel through which lived experience had met legal authority to forge change. As he stepped down, his gaze met Antoine Johnson's. Across the crowded room, their eyes locked. In that brief moment, 2 men, one young and voiceless, one older and cloaked in authority, shared recognition. They had both been targeted, both reduced to nothing but skin color under the glare of suspicion. But now they stood on opposite sides of a courtroom transformed, linked by an unspoken understanding. Humiliation could become power, and power could become change. Outside the courthouse, the story was already spreading. Cameras flashed, microphones extended, activists chanted. For Marcus, the noise faded into the background. What mattered wasn't the headlines, but the knowledge that something real had shifted. Justice, he knew, was not about perfection. It was about progress. And for once, progress had been carved into the record of the court, permanent and undeniable. Weeks after the historic ruling, the community center auditorium was filled to capacity. Folding chairs stretched wall to wall, every seat taken by residents, officers, activists, and local officials. The air buzzed with anticipation. A banner at the front read Police Accountability Commission, Inaugural Session. At the podium stood Marcus Holloway, no longer in robes but still carrying the authority of his office. "When I was appointed to lead this commission," Marcus began, his voice steady and measured, "many questioned whether real change was possible. After all, we've seen task forces come and go. Reports gather dust, recommendations ignored. But what makes this different is sitting in this room right now, people from every side of our community, willing to face difficult truths together." He gestured to the crowd. Uniformed officers sat shoulder to shoulder with local activists. City council members listened beside neighborhood elders. Students and faith leaders leaned forward, eager to take part. It was an unprecedented gathering, and Marcus knew it symbolized something fragile yet powerful. The reforms had already begun to take root. Every patrol officer in Abington Township now wore a body camera that could not be manually disabled. Footage was uploaded automatically to an independent system overseen by civilians. For the first time, the eyes of the community were watching alongside the eyes of the law. The department's evaluation system had undergone a complete overhaul. Gone were the days when productivity was measured by sheer numbers of stops or arrests. Instead, officers were now assessed on constitutional compliance, community engagement, and problem-solving skills. Success was defined not by how many people were handcuffed, but by how effectively officers prevented harm and built trust. "Our preliminary data," Marcus told the audience, "shows a 40% reduction in discretionary stops. Yet crime rates have remained stable." He let the numbers hang in the air. This suggests what many have long argued, that aggressive stop practices don't make communities safer. They only erode trust. The applause that followed was warm, not explosive. It wasn't the sound of triumph, but of cautious hope. Among those applauding in the front row was Officer Darrell Jackson. His courage to speak during the hearing had changed the trajectory of his career. Instead of being ostracized, he had been promoted to lead the Community Relations Division. His new unit was tasked with rebuilding bridges between police and neighborhoods long scarred by mistrust. Jackson sat tall, the weight of responsibility visible but welcome. Not far behind him sat Officer Kyle Reynolds. After completing intensive retraining, he had returned to duty, this time under close supervision. The once cocky officer now carried himself with quieter humility. He had volunteered to mentor younger recruits, teaching them not just procedures but the constitutional principles behind them. It was a paradox Marcus reflected on often. The man who once parroted department culture now helped to dismantle it. At the back of the room sat Thomas Brennan. He had not fared as well. Suspended, disciplined, and forced into counseling, he was wrestling with his own biases in ways that did not come easily. Though he attended meetings quietly, saying little, his presence mattered. It signaled that even those who resisted change were not excluded from it. Transformation, Marcus believed, required space for difficult journeys. Then there was Antoine Johnson. With his settlement money, he had re-enrolled in college, pursuing a degree in criminal justice. That evening, he stood and addressed the crowd. "When I was pulled over that night, I thought my life was ruined. I never imagined I'd be here helping shape policy. What happened to me should never happen to anyone else. Now I want to work so that it doesn't." The room erupted in applause. Marcus felt a swell of pride. Not for himself, but for the community that had refused to let Johnson's humiliation be the final chapter. Beyond policies and statistics, Marcus knew the most profound change was intangible. It lived in the countless small interactions happening across the township, at traffic stops where officers explained their reasoning with respect, in neighborhoods where patrols walked beats, greeting residents by name, in the absence of fear where once there had only been suspicion. The Sunoco station where Marcus had been arrested had become an unlikely symbol of this transformation. Manager Raj Patel had installed a small plaque near Pump 3 that read, "Here, change began." Once a month, The station hosted community police dialogues in its modest seating area. Officers and residents shared coffee, stories, and sometimes hard disagreements, but always with the shared purpose of understanding. Marcus's own family had been deeply shaped by the events. His teenage son, Jamal, had struggled at first with anger and disillusionment. Seeing his father handcuffed had shaken his belief in fairness. But over time, Jamal had channeled his feelings into action. He joined the Youth Advisory Council, which provided direct input on police training programs. He began considering careers in law or even law enforcement, determined to continue the work of reform from the inside. Change was not smooth, nor was it complete. Some officers resisted the new evaluation system, grumbling about handcuffs on policing. Some residents remained skeptical, scarred by years of mistreatment. Trust was fragile, earned only through time and consistency. But progress was measurable, visible in the lowered numbers of stops, in the tone of community meetings, in the way conversations were shifting from accusation to collaboration. Transformation isn't an event, Marcus reminded the commission as the session drew to a close. It's a process. What happened at that gas station revealed deep problems, yes, but it also revealed our community's capacity to confront those problems, to refuse denial, to commit to something better. That evening, as the crowd dispersed into the cool night, Marcus drove quietly back toward the Sunoco station. His tank was half full. He didn't need gas. Still, he pulled in and stepped out, looking at the plaque Patel had installed. At the next pump, a young black man filled his car, shoulders tense as he glanced toward a police cruiser parked near the convenience store. The wariness in his posture was unmistakable, a reflex born of experience. Marcus recognized it instantly, the same wariness he had carried just weeks before. The officer emerged from the store carrying a bottle of water. Instead of posturing or glaring, he nodded politely at the young man, then at Marcus. The young man's shoulders eased ever so slightly. His eyes met Marcus's for a brief moment. A silent acknowledgement passed between them. Not a problem solved, but progress made. Marcus inhaled deeply, the smell of gasoline oddly grounding. The system was still imperfect. Perhaps it always would be, but it was better than it had been. And in the lifelong pursuit of justice, better was worth fighting for. The weeks of hearings, reforms, and community meetings had passed, but the echoes of that night at the gas station still lingered for Marcus Holloway. Every time he pulled the black robe over his shoulders, he was reminded of how fragile dignity could be when confronted with unchecked authority. He had worn the robe for decades, but only now did he truly feel its weight, not just as a symbol of impartiality, but as armor forged in lived experience. On a quiet evening, Marcus returned once more to the Sunoco station. The sky was a pale lavender, the last threads of sunset clinging to the horizon. The plaque near Pump 3 caught the fading light, its engraving simple but powerful. Here, change began. He wasn't there for gas. His tank was nearly full. He was there because the place had become a marker in his life, a physical reminder of the line between humiliation and transformation. Standing there, Marcus thought of the countless others who had not been judges, who had not had the protection of reputation or witnesses or viral videos. Their stories, too often, had ended differently, silenced, forgotten, dismissed as unfounded complaints in dusty files. That awareness was what drove him now. As he looked around the station, his attention fell on a young black man at the neighboring pump. The man's eyes darted warily toward a patrol car parked near the convenience store. His body was tense, shoulders raised, every movement calculated. Marcus recognized the instinct immediately. It was the posture of someone bracing for the worst, someone who had learned to expect suspicion before fairness. A moment later, the store door swung open. A uniformed officer stepped out, a bottle of water in hand. For an instant, Marcus's chest tightened. Old habits of fear resurfaced, reflexive and sharp. But then the officer glanced toward the young man, offered a small nod of acknowledgement, and moved on without incident. The change was subtle, almost fragile, but it was real. The young man's shoulders eased. His eyes flicked toward Marcus, and in that silent exchange, Marcus saw recognition. The nod said, "Not solved. Not perfect, but different." Progress didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Marcus carried that whisper back into his reflections. The reforms were still new, the resistance still real. Some officers grumbled about oversight, and some residents still carried wounds too deep to heal quickly. But the data was undeniable. Fewer arbitrary stops, more engagement, stable crime rates. For the first time in years, conversations between police and community weren't dominated by hostility alone. They included cautious cooperation. It was not utopia. It was not victory, but it was better. That lesson crystallized for Marcus. Justice is not a destination carved in stone. It is a process, demanding vigilance, persistence, and humility. Systems of power rarely admit failure easily. It takes people willing to speak, to risk, to insist. Officer Jackson had risked his career to testify. Reynolds had cracked under pressure and admitted truths that chipped at a wall of silence. Even Brennan, through his furious outburst, had revealed prejudice that could no longer hide in coded language. Each role had mattered, even the uncomfortable ones. Change never unfolded neatly. It came in uneven steps, missteps, and reluctant admissions. Most importantly, Marcus saw that real reform required more than new policies or shiny technology. Body cameras and oversight committees were tools, but they meant nothing without a shift in culture. Justice was lived in everyday interactions, at traffic stops, in quiet nods at gas stations, in the relief of a young man who realized he would get to go home safely after all. The story of his arrest had become larger than him. It was a reminder that even those entrusted to uphold the law could be reduced to stereotypes, their rights dismissed in an instant. It was also proof that humiliation, when witnessed and confronted, could be transformed into momentum for accountability. He often wondered what would have happened had Patel not spoken, had bystanders not recorded, had Jackson not recognized him. He might have been processed like so many others, his protest ignored, his ID dismissed as fraudulent. The thought unsettled him, but it also fueled his commitment. No one's rights should depend on luck or title. As the months passed, Marcus began to speak at law schools, community forums, and police academies. He told his story not as a tale of personal vindication, but as a case study in systemic failure and the possibility of renewal. He ended every talk with the same message. Justice isn't about perfection, it's about progress. And progress is always worth fighting for. In quieter moments, he thought about his children. Jamal especially had transformed his anger into activism, serving on the Youth Advisory Council. Watching his son grow into a young man determined to shape the future filled Marcus with both pride and caution. The burden of reform should not have to fall on the next generation, yet inevitably it would. His role now was to make that burden lighter. The narrative of Judge Holloway's arrest traveled far beyond Philadelphia. It was covered in national news, debated on talk shows, shared across social media. To some it was a scandal. To others, a parable of resilience. For Marcus, it was neither. It was simply a reminder that the line between justice and injustice is thin, and that it takes constant pressure to keep it from breaking. In one of his last public addresses for the Commission's first year, Marcus posed a question to the audience. Has there been a moment in your life when you witnessed or experienced injustice and wished you could change the system? If you had that power, what would you do? Would you step aside, or would you use your perspective to push for accountability? The silence that followed was heavy, reflective. Marcus looked out at the faces, young and old, weary and hopeful. He knew the answers would vary, but the act of asking mattered. Change began with uncomfortable questions. As the applause faded and the hall emptied, Marcus thought back to the night he had been handcuffed at Pump 3. The humiliation still stung, but it no longer defined him. It had become a catalyst, a turning point, proof that even the most degrading moments could spark transformation when confronted with courage and truth. Justice was not a finish line he had crossed. It was a road he and his community had only begun to walk, uneven, uncertain, but forward, and that, Marcus knew, was enough to keep believing.